China and the Dominican Republic establish diplomatic relations as Beijing increases ties with Latin America. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Last month, the Dominican Republic became the latest Latin American country to cut ties with Taiwan and establish diplomatic relations with Beijing.
From today, our states recognize each other reciprocally, and therefore we will exchange ambassadors in the immediate future. We will work to tighten bilateral cooperation on trade, investment, financing, tourism, and education, among other things.
It was back in January 2015 when Chinese President Xi Jinping set a 5-year goal of $500 billion in trade and $250 billion in direct investment in Latin America. Last year, trade reached $266 billion, with China becoming the biggest trading partner for such top economies as Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And over the past decade, Latin American countries have increased exports to the Chinese market to nearly $100 billion a year. All this as China is encouraging countries in the region to join its ever-expanding Belt and Road Initiative. For more on China's growing ties with Latin America, we're joined by Remi Piet in New York. He's a senior director at America's Market Intelligence. Li He is with us from Boston. He's a political science professor at Merrimack College. Joining us from Beijing is the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University, Jiang Shixue. And Jorge Heine is the former Chilean Ambassador to China. He's currently a global fellow at the Wilson International Center for Scholars right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me start with you. As I mentioned, in January of 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping set a 5-year goal. $500 billion in trade, $250 billion in direct investment for the Latin American region. 2018 now, what kind of progress have we seen?
Well, we saw a bit of a downturn after that because of the downturn in commodity prices. But last year was very good. You mentioned the figure of 266 billion, which is a near record. The last highest figure was in 2013, a little bit higher. But it seems to me we are back on track. And we can also say the same about Chinese investment in Latin America. Yesterday, it was announced that Tianqi, one of the leading lithium companies in China, got into SQM, which is one of the largest lithium producers in the world, and in Latin America, in Chile, for $4 billion. So we're seeing a lot of movement, and it seems to me that the latest developments on the diplomatic front in the Dominican Republic, last year in Panama, attest to that. And my own wager is that we're going to see more of that. Haiti may be next in line.
Okay, Li He, earlier this year, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he spoke at the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States meeting in Santiago. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
We are going to work together to promote the interconnectivity of infrastructure, to create a big bridge, a corridor between both sides of the Pacific, the Asiatic continent and Latin America and the Caribbean.
So, Li He, we heard the Foreign Minister Wang Yi talking about the need for countries to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. He wants them to join this development plan. What's been the response?
Yes, initially, Latin American country was not included in the One Belt, One Road initiative of the Chinese strategy. That is the action in the right direction. I think in the long run, China will invest more and treat more with the region when Latin American countries participate more actively in the One Belt, One Road initiative.
Remi Piet, the One Belt, One Road initiative is a development outreach plan, the focus of which is on infrastructure development. How important is that for the region, the Latin America region?
It is very important because there's strong needs in Latin America and across different countries. And definitely Dominican Republic is a country that has opportunities in terms of mining, energy sector. But you also have a series of airports throughout Latin America, whether in Mexico City, Bogota in Colombia, Cusco, Lima in Peru, that should be built in the coming years. So strong opportunities for Chinese companies in the region. But they really need to understand also the domestic politics and how each country works differently from its neighbors.
Jiang Shixue, of course, all this is not happening in isolation. We have to remember that the biggest and most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere is the United States. And we have heard both from the former Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, as well as the U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. We've heard them raise concerns about China's involvement and its growing relationship in Latin America. How does China view that?
Well, I would like to say that China's relationship with the region is a kind of a part of the South-South cooperation. This kind of bilateral relationship is targeting against nobody at all. So the U.S. should be a kind of a trilateral partner for this bilateral relationship. But the U.S. is quite concerned about this kind of relationship. Well, let me tell you that several years ago, the former Secretary of State, John Kerry, said the Monroe Doctrine is over. But Tillerson said, well, the Monroe Doctrine is still relevant. So I really don't know, as a Chinese scholar, I really don't know what is a signal from the White House. But hopefully, the U.S. will understand China's relationship with the region is better for both U.S., Latin America, and China.
Remi, what do you make of how Washington views China's involvement in Latin America? I mean, do these two countries have to be competitors? Can't they be complementary to each other, or trilateral, as Jiang Shixue just told us?
Well, as former interlocutor just said, indeed, Latin America was traditionally seen as the backyard of the U.S. So obviously, the increased presence of Chinese investment is an element of worry for Washington. The issue here is that sometimes, unfortunately, Chinese companies operating in Latin America have faced issues of not developing, let's say, corporate social responsibility policies, or not integrating elements of local politics, and therefore they're upset inside those countries that are played against the interests of Chinese companies. And Washington is eager on mentioning that sometimes Chinese investment might not be in the best interest of the host country, because they're clearly worried about the increased presence of China in the continent.
Let me add something to that. It's important to keep in mind that over the past 20 years or so, Latin America has gone beyond the situation in which it looked only to the United States and to Western Europe for its trade and investment links. Latin American countries have diversified their trade and investment links and their diplomatic relations quite a bit in this period. So we are way past the moment when Washington could dictate to the Latin American capitals what they should and shouldn't do. And as you mentioned earlier, countries like Brazil, my own country, Chile, Peru, China is the #1 trading partner. So, I mean, what are you going to do? Are you going to somehow deteriorate those ties? This is, a situation in which Latin American countries deal with the whole world, and China has become a leading trade and investment partner, and that is not going to change.
Right, Ambassador, and we have seen recent developments reflecting the kind of changing priorities, shifting alliances in the region as well. I mean, we just had the Summit of the Americas. China was there as an observer. That's the first time that happened.
A real breakthrough.
The United States was not there. Well, I mean, President Trump was
Vice President Pence was
President Trump was not there.
That's right. Yes. Well, it seems to me that is emblematic of the situation we are going through. And it seems to me, if the United States wants to do something, it should put something on the table. The way diplomacy works is if you say, I'm unhappy with something, well, what are you offering? And it seems to me, if they say trade flows with China is something that Washington is worried about, well, they should say, well, what are we going to do about increasing trade flows with Latin America? And that is not happening. What we're seeing, for example, what we're seeing in NAFTA is something different. And also, we should keep in mind that the word is that once NAFTA is restructured, the next step will be to restructure the free trade agreements with other Latin American countries, like Peru, like Chile, like Central America and the Dominican Republic. And what does restructuring mean? It might mean less access for Latin American exporters and producers. So, you know, people in the region are quite concerned about this situation.
Li He, there are some analysts, some experts who say that the United States has to some extent been indifferent to Latin America, that the United States has ignored Latin America, and that to a certain extent has given China a chance to fill in that gap. Do you agree?
I agree. The trade between China and the United States increased, and trade between Latin America and China increased significantly. But United States neglect Latin America in the past 2 decades. In recent years, since Donald Trump became the president of the United States, that trend continues. For example, TPP was withdrawn, and NAFTA is renegotiated. And Donald Trump even suggested to build a wall with the southern border. That's a very wrong message to the people in Latin America.
Remi, what is your view on this? You know, as we just heard, this is not something new. This is not something that started with the Trump administration. For 2 decades, the United States has not been completely invested in countries in Latin America.
Yeah, it's very true. It's also the consequence of the fact that in terms of in the infrastructure sector, energy sector, mining sectors, Chinese companies are very strong actors that actually answer the needs of the countries in Latin America. There's maybe not that strong actors in the US in terms of infrastructure that have been looking closely at the needs of Latin America. Also, Chinese companies are maybe less risk averse on those issues. Now, it's important to understand, for example, this investment in SQM in Chile, which is a strong investment. You want to make sure also that it doesn't lead to issues in the mining sector in different countries, such as we've seen in Ecuador with Rio Branco, or with the investment from Tongling or China Railways in Mirador, where there's lack of understanding of how to operate inside each country, so it's actually a win-win partnership. But once Chinese companies will understand that, they will be strong leaders in Latin America beyond the simple numbers of trade and investment.
This is very important to keep in mind. In South America, we have big infrastructure needs. We are exporting more and more to Asia. We need to spruce up our ports, our highways, our railways, our tunnels. And it seems to me that in that sense, Chinese companies, which have tremendous experience and capital and expertise in this, can make a very significant contribution. In the southern cone, we're looking at what is known as bioceanic corridors. That is to bring production from Brazil, from Uruguay, from Argentina to Chilean ports across the Andes. Now, these are major investments. And it seems to me that Chinese banks and Chinese companies can make a significant contribution to make this happen.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.